Sarah Martinez had always been different from the other girls in her small Texas town. At 28, she worked as a nurse at the local veterans hospital, dedicating her life to caring for wounded soldiers who had returned from overseas. Her colleagues respected her work ethic and compassion, but there was one thing about Sarah that always drew unwanted attention: the intricate tattoo that covered most of her left forearm. The tattoo was unlike anything most people in Millfield had ever seen. It depicted a fierce eagle with its wings spread wide, clutching a banner that read Semper Fi in bold letters. Below the eagle, smaller text spelled out coordinates that meant nothing to most observers. The artwork was incredibly detailed, with every feather carefully shaded and the eagle's eyes holding an intensity that seemed almost alive. Sarah usually kept it covered with long sleeves, even during the sweltering Texas summers, but sometimes the fabric would ride up, revealing glimpses of the design. On this particular Tuesday morning, Sarah was rushing to work when her car broke down just 2 blocks from the hospital. The summer heat was already unbearable at 8 in the morning, and she had no choice but to walk the remaining distance in her short-sleeved scrubs. She tried to keep her left arm positioned away from passing pedestrians, but it was impossible to hide the tattoo completely. As she hurried down Main Street, she passed the Morning Glory Cafe, where a group of local business owners gathered every morning to discuss town affairs over coffee and pastries. These were respectable people: the bank manager, the hardware store owner, the real estate agent, and several other prominent citizens who considered themselves the moral backbone of Millfield. "Would you look at that?" muttered Frank Morrison, the bank manager, as Sarah walked past the large windows. "That nurse from the VA hospital has some kind of military tattoo. What's a woman doing with something like that?" The others turned to look, and soon the entire table was buzzing with whispered comments and disapproving glances. Margaret Hawthorne, who owned the town's only bookstore, shook her head in disgust. "It's absolutely inappropriate. Military symbols should be earned, not just tattooed on for decoration. She probably got it because she thinks it looks tough or edgy." "My son served 2 tours in Afghanistan," added Tom Bradley, the hardware store owner. "He would be furious to see someone wearing Marine symbols who never served a day in their life. It's disrespectful to real veterans." The conversation grew louder as more people joined in. Someone mentioned that Sarah worked with veterans at the hospital, but this only seemed to fuel their indignation further. "That makes it even worse," Frank declared. "She's around real heroes every day, and she still thinks it's appropriate to pretend she's one of them with that tattoo." Sarah could feel their stares burning into her back as she continued walking. She had experienced this kind of judgment before, though never quite so openly. Most people in town knew her as the dedicated nurse who worked extra shifts and never complained, but the tattoo always changed how they looked at her. Some assumed she was trying to appear tough or rebellious. Others thought she was making a fashion statement. Very few bothered to consider that there might be a deeper story behind the ink. By the time she reached the hospital, Sarah's cheeks were flushed with embarrassment and frustration. She pulled on a white cardigan from her locker, even though it would make her uncomfortably warm throughout her 12-hour shift. The fabric covered the tattoo completely, but it couldn't erase the feeling of being judged and misunderstood. Her first patient of the day was Robert Chen, a young Marine who had lost his right leg to an improvised explosive device in Syria. Robert was struggling with depression and anger, refusing to participate in physical therapy and barely speaking to the medical staff. Sarah had been working with him for weeks, trying to break through his defensive walls with patience and understanding. "Morning, Robert," she said gently as she entered his room. "How are you feeling today?" Robert turned away from her, staring out the window at the parking lot. "Same as always. Like garbage." Sarah began checking his vital signs, her movements careful and professional. She had dealt with hundreds of wounded veterans over the years, and she understood the complex emotions they faced. The physical injuries were often easier to treat than the psychological scars that remained invisible to most observers. "The physical therapist wants to try some new exercises today," she continued, making notes on his chart. "I know it's frustrating, but these small steps really do add up over time." "Easy for you to say," Robert muttered. "You've never been through anything like this. You don't understand what it's like to lose everything that defined who you were." Sarah paused in her work, considering her response carefully. She wanted to help Robert, but she also knew that sharing too much personal information could complicate their professional relationship. The hospital had strict guidelines about maintaining appropriate boundaries with patients. "You're right," she said finally. "I can't fully understand your experience, but I do know that you're stronger than you think, and that healing takes time." As she continued her rounds throughout the morning, Sarah encountered similar attitudes from several other patients and their families. Some were grateful for her care, but others seemed to view her as just another civilian who couldn't possibly comprehend what military service meant. The tattoo remained hidden beneath her cardigan, but she felt its presence like a secret that grew heavier with each passing hour. During her lunch break, Sarah sat alone in the hospital cafeteria, picking at a salad while checking her phone for messages from her mechanic about her car. The Morning Glory Cafe incident still bothered her, though she tried to push it from her mind. She had learned long ago that explaining herself to judgmental strangers was usually pointless. Most people saw what they wanted to see and heard what they wanted to hear. The afternoon brought new challenges as the hospital prepared for a special visit from a Marine colonel who was touring VA facilities across the state. The entire staff was nervous about the inspection, making sure every detail was perfect for their distinguished guest. Sarah found herself wondering what this colonel would think of their humble facility, and whether he would notice the dedication of the nurses and doctors who worked there. By 3 o'clock that afternoon, word had spread throughout Millfield about Sarah's tattoo and the morning's cafe discussion. Small towns had a way of turning whispers into headlines, and this story had captured the imagination of residents who rarely had anything more exciting to discuss than the weather or local high school football scores. Helen Morrison, Frank's wife, had called her sister in Dallas to share the scandalous news. "You won't believe what we discovered about that nurse at the VA hospital," she began, her voice dripping with righteous indignation. "She's been walking around town with a Marine tattoo, pretending to be something she's not. Frank says it's stolen valor, pure and simple." The story grew with each telling. By evening, some versions claimed Sarah had multiple military tattoos covering both arms. Others suggested she wore military uniforms to local events, though this was completely untrue. A few creative storytellers even invented tales of her claiming to be a decorated war veteran at community gatherings. Meanwhile, Sarah remained at the hospital, unaware that she had become the center of town gossip. Her shift was particularly challenging that day, as several new patients had arrived from various conflict zones. Each wounded soldier brought their own story of sacrifice and trauma, and Sarah approached each case with the same level of professional care and personal compassion that had defined her career. Her most difficult case was Private Danny Rodriguez, a 19-year-old who had lost both hands in an explosive blast just 3 weeks earlier. Danny was angry, scared, and completely overwhelmed by the reality of his situation. His family had driven down from Oklahoma to be with him, but their grief and helplessness only seemed to make Danny feel more isolated. "I can't do anything anymore," Danny told Sarah as she helped him with his evening medication. "I can't even hold a cup of water without help." "What kind of life is that?" Sarah sat down beside his bed, her voice gentle but firm. "It's going to be different, Danny. I won't lie to you about that. But different doesn't mean over. You're going to learn new ways to do things, and you're going to discover strengths you didn't know you had." "How would you know?" Danny's voice was bitter. "You've got both your hands. You've never been in combat. You don't know what it's like to have everything taken away in 1 second." Sarah felt the familiar weight of these conversations. Every wounded veteran she had treated over the years had asked similar questions, and she understood their frustration. How could someone who had never served, never been in danger, never sacrificed anything for their country possibly understand their pain? "You're absolutely right," she said quietly. "I haven't walked in your shoes, but I've walked beside a lot of people who have. And I've learned that healing isn't just about getting back to who you were before. Sometimes it's about discovering who you can become." As the evening wore on, Sarah received a text message from her friend Jessica, who worked at the Morning Glory Cafe. "Hey girl, there's some crazy gossip going around about you and your tattoo. Frank Morrison is telling everyone you're faking military service. Thought you should know." Sarah stared at her phone screen, feeling a familiar knot form in her stomach. She had hoped that moving to a small town would mean fewer judgmental stares and whispered comments about her appearance. Instead, it seemed that news traveled faster and lingered longer in a place where everyone knew everyone else's business. She thought about texting back to defend herself, but what would be the point? Jessica was a friend, but explaining the truth would only create more questions and complications. Sarah had learned that some stories were too personal and too painful to share with casual acquaintances. Her shift ended at 8 o'clock, but Sarah stayed late to help with a new patient who had just arrived by ambulance. Staff Sergeant Michael Torres had been flown in from Germany after suffering severe injuries in a roadside bombing. His condition was stable but critical, and the medical team worked frantically to ensure he received the best possible care. As Sarah assisted the doctors and other nurses, she noticed that Michael had a tattoo similar to hers on his right shoulder. The eagle design was slightly different, but the Semper Fi banner was identical. When the immediate medical crisis had passed and Michael was resting comfortably, Sarah found herself studying the tattoo and remembering the day she had gotten her own. The night supervisor, Janet Williams, noticed Sarah's exhaustion and gently suggested she head home. "You've been here 14 hours, Janet pointed out. "Your car situation is sorted out, right? I can give you a ride if you need one." Sarah's mechanic had indeed fixed her car, which was now waiting in the hospital parking lot. She gathered her belongings and walked slowly toward the exit, dreading the drive through town. By now, half of Millfield probably knew about the nurse with the fake military tattoo, and she would have to face their stares and whispers for weeks to come. As she reached her car, Sarah's phone buzzed with a call from her landlord, Mrs. Patterson, an elderly widow who rented out the small apartment above her garage. Mrs. Patterson was generally kind and understanding, but she was also deeply concerned about her reputation in the community. "Sarah, dear," Mrs. Patterson began, her voice careful and diplomatic, "I've been hearing some concerning stories about you today. People are saying you have inappropriate tattoos and that you're misrepresenting yourself as a veteran. Now, I'm not one to listen to gossip, but I do have to think about how this reflects on my property and my standing in the community." Sarah closed her eyes and leaned against her car. "Mrs. Patterson, I can assure you that I've never claimed to be a veteran or misrepresented myself in any way. The tattoo has personal significance, but I understand why people might find it confusing." "Well, I hope you understand my position," Mrs. Patterson continued. "I've lived in this town for 73 years, and my late husband served in Korea. Military symbols mean something to people here, and they don't take kindly to anyone who seems to be using them inappropriately." After ending the call, Sarah sat in her car for several minutes processing the events of the day. She had moved to Millfield specifically to work with veterans at the hospital, believing that her skills and experience would be valued in a community that supported military families. Instead, she found herself being judged by people who knew nothing about her background or her reasons for choosing this career. The irony wasn't lost on her. While she was spending her days caring for wounded warriors and helping them navigate the most difficult periods of their lives, the people of Millfield were spreading rumors about her character and questioning her integrity. The veteran she treated saw her as a dedicated professional, but her own neighbors viewed her as a fraud. As she finally started her car and began the short drive home, Sarah made a mental note to buy more long-sleeved shirts. If covering her tattoo would reduce the gossip and allow her to focus on her work, then that was a small price to pay. She had faced worse challenges before, and she would survive this one too. What Sarah didn't know was that tomorrow would bring a visitor to the hospital who would change everything. Colonel James Mitchell, a decorated Marine with 30 years of service, was scheduled to arrive at 9 o'clock sharp for his inspection tour. The colonel had his own reasons for visiting small-town VA hospitals, and his own stories about the significance of certain tattoos that marked pivotal moments in a person's life. Colonel James Mitchell arrived at the Millfield Veterans Hospital precisely at 9 o'clock Wednesday morning, just as he had promised. His military bearing was unmistakable even in civilian clothes. A crisp polo shirt, pressed khakis, and polished shoes that reflected the fluorescent lights of the hospital lobby. At 55 years old, the colonel carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who had spent 3 decades leading Marines through some of the most challenging situations imaginable. The YIM hospital staff had been preparing for his visit all week. Dr. Peterson, the chief of staff, had briefed everyone on the colonel's impressive service record. Mitchell had served multiple tours in Iraq and Afghanistan, earning numerous commendations including a Silver Star for valor under fire. More importantly for their purposes, he now worked with the Department of Veterans Affairs to evaluate and improve services at hospitals across the country. Sarah had arrived early that morning, making sure her cardigan was securely buttoned and her appearance was professional. The gossip from the previous day still weighed on her mind, but she was determined not to let personal issues interfere with her work. Veterans like Colonel Mitchell deserve the best care possible, and she wouldn't allow small-town rumors to distract her from that mission. The colonel's first stop was a meeting with the administrative staff, where he reviewed patient statistics, budget reports, and facility maintenance records. His questions were thorough but fair, and his suggestions showed genuine concern for both the veterans being served and the staff providing that service. Dr. Peterson was impressed by the colonel's practical approach and his obvious understanding of the challenges facing rural VA hospitals. "We'd like to show you our patient care units next," Dr. Peterson said as they concluded the morning briefing. "Our nursing staff is particularly dedicated, and I think you'll be impressed by the level of personal attention our veterans receive." As they moved through the hospital corridors, Colonel Mitchell noticed the small details that revealed the character of the institution. Walls were decorated with thank you cards from former patients and their families. Bulletin boards displayed photos of hospital fundraisers and community events supporting veterans. The atmosphere was warm and welcoming, despite the limitations imposed by an obviously tight budget. Their first stop was the rehabilitation wing, where physical therapist Maria Santos was working with Sergeant First Class David Kim, who was relearning to walk after losing his left leg below the knee. The colonel watched quietly as Maria guided David through a series of exercises, noting her patience and encouraging manner. "How long have you been working here?" Colonel Mitchell asked Maria during a brief break in the therapy session. 3 years, Maria replied. "I actually moved here from Houston specifically to work with veterans. My brother served 2 tours in Afghanistan, and I wanted to give back to the military community." The colonel nodded approvingly. Throughout his career, he had learned to recognize genuine dedication, and he saw it clearly in Maria's approach to her work. He made notes in his small leather notebook, recording observations that would become part of his official report. Their next destination was the medical wing, where Sarah was checking on Private Rodriguez, the young soldier who had lost both hands. Colonel Mitchell observed from the doorway as Sarah helped Danny with his morning routine, her movements gentle but efficient. He noticed how she spoke to Danny as an equal, not as a victim to be pitied. "That young man has a difficult road ahead," the colonel commented quietly to Dr. Peterson as they moved away from Danny's room. "Yes, but Nurse Martinez has a special gift for connecting with our most challenging cases," Dr. Peterson replied. "She's been instrumental in helping several patients who had given up hope." Colonel Mitchell filed this information away mentally. In his experience, the best VA hospitals were defined not by their equipment or facilities, but by staff members who truly understood the veteran experience. He was beginning to form a positive impression of the Millfield facility. As they continued their tour, Sarah remained focused on her patients, unaware that she was being observed and evaluated. Her cardigan remained buttoned despite the increasing warmth of the day, and she made sure to keep her left arm positioned away from the visiting colonel whenever possible. The morning progressed smoothly until they reached the room of Staff Sergeant Michael Torres, the patient who had arrived the previous evening with severe injuries from a roadside bombing. Michael was awake but groggy from pain medication, and his condition required constant monitoring. Sarah was adjusting Michael's IV line when Colonel Mitchell entered the room with Dr. Peterson and the administrative team. The colonel's presence seemed to energize Michael, who struggled to sit up straighter in his hospital bed. "At ease, Sergeant," Colonel Mitchell said with a slight smile. "How are they treating you here?" "Good, sir," Michael replied, though his voice was weak. "Real good. The nurses here know what they're doing." Colonel Mitchell approached the bedside, his experienced eyes taking in Michael's injuries and current condition. He had visited hundreds of wounded warriors over the years, and he understood the complex emotions that came with sudden disability and extended recovery periods. "What unit were you with?" the colonel asked. "2nd Battalion, 1st Marines, sir. We were doing convoy security outside Fallujah when we hit the IED." The colonel nodded knowingly. He had served in that same area during his earlier deployments and understood the challenges of the mission Michael described. As they spoke, Sarah continued her work around them, checking monitors and updating charts with quiet professionalism. "This nurse has been taking real good care of me," Michael said, gesturing toward Sarah with his uninjured arm. She understands what we've been through better than most people. Colonel Mitchell glanced at Sarah with increased interest. Something in Michael's tone suggested there was more to this statement than casual appreciation for good medical care. The colonel had developed excellent instincts about people during his long career, and he sensed an undercurrent of shared understanding between the young Marine and his nurse. Nurse Martinez has been with us for 2 years, Dr. Peterson interjected. She transferred here from a larger hospital in San Antonio and has become one of our most valuable team members. As they prepared to leave Michael's room, Colonel Mitchell noticed Sarah organizing medication supplies near the window. The afternoon sun was streaming through the glass, and despite her cardigan, he caught a glimpse of what appeared to be dark ink on her left forearm. The sight triggered a memory, though he couldn't quite place why the image seemed familiar. The tour continued through the rest of the hospital, with stops at the pharmacy, the cafeteria, and the administrative offices. Colonel Mitchell maintained his professional demeanor throughout, asking pertinent questions and making detailed observations. However, part of his attention remained focused on the nurse with the hidden tattoo and the wounded Marine's comment about her understanding what they had been through. During lunch in the hospital cafeteria, the conversation turned to staffing challenges and retention issues that affected many rural VA facilities. Colonel Mitchell listened carefully as Dr. Peterson and other administrators discussed their efforts to recruit and maintain qualified personnel. The challenge is finding people who are not just clinically competent, but who also understand the unique needs of our veteran population, Dr. Peterson explained. Military culture can be difficult for civilians to grasp, and that cultural gap sometimes creates barriers to effective treatment. Have you found ways to bridge that gap? Colonel Mitchell asked. We've been fortunate to recruit several staff members who have personal connections to the military, Dr. Peterson replied. Family members of veterans, people who've worked extensively with military populations, individuals who understand that serving our country leaves lasting marks on a person, both visible and invisible. Colonel Mitchell nodded thoughtfully. The phrase about lasting marks resonated with him in ways that Dr. Peterson couldn't possibly understand. The colonel carried his own invisible scars from 3 decades of military service, along with some that were quite visible to anyone who cared to look closely enough. As the afternoon wore on, Colonel Mitchell found himself thinking more about Nurse Martinez and the brief glimpse he had caught of her tattoo. Something about the design nagged at his memory, and he made a mental note to observe her more carefully during the remainder of his visit. The pivotal moment came unexpectedly during what should have been a routine visit to Robert Chen, the depressed Marine who had been refusing physical therapy. Colonel Mitchell had requested to speak privately with some of the more challenging cases, wanting to understand how the hospital staff dealt with veterans who were struggling with both physical and emotional recovery. Sarah was in Robert's room, attempting once again to encourage him to work with the physical therapy team. Robert sat in his wheelchair by the window, staring out at the parking lot with the same defeated expression he had worn for weeks. I know it's hard, Robert, Sarah was saying as Colonel Mitchell entered the room. But isolation isn't going to help you heal. Your body needs movement and your mind needs purpose. Robert turned away from her, his voice bitter and sharp. What would you know about it? You're just another civilian playing dress-up with military tattoos, pretending to understand what we've been through. The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. Somehow the town gossip had reached even her patients, poisoning the therapeutic relationships she had worked so hard to build. She felt her cheeks flush with embarrassment and hurt, especially with Colonel Mitchell witnessing this humiliating moment. Robert, that's not, she began, but he cut her off. I've heard people talking, Robert continued, his anger building. You've got some Marine tattoo on your arm, but you've never served a day in your life. Do you have any idea how insulting that is to those of us who actually earned the right to wear Marine symbols? Colonel Mitchell stepped forward, his expression serious but controlled. Son, I think you might want to reconsider your assumptions. Robert looked up at the colonel with surprise. Sir, I didn't mean any disrespect to you, but this nurse has been pretending to understand what military service means, and it's not right. What makes you think she's pretending? Colonel Mitchell asked quietly. Look at her. Robert gestured dismissively. She's never been in combat. She's never served overseas. She just works here and thinks that gives her the right to wear our symbols. Sarah stood frozen, unsure whether to defend herself or simply leave the room. The situation was spiraling out of control, and she didn't want to make things worse by arguing with a patient in front of a visiting dignitary. Colonel Mitchell studied Sarah for a long moment, his experienced eyes taking in her posture, her expression, and the way she held herself under pressure. Something in her bearing reminded him of other people he had known, people who carried invisible wounds and unspoken stories. "Nurse Martinez," he said calmly, "would you mind showing me that tattoo Robert mentioned?" Sarah hesitated, her hand moving instinctively to her cardigan sleeve. "Sir, I don't think that's necessary. I should probably—" "Please," Colonel Mitchell said, his voice gentle but firm. "I'd like to see it." With trembling fingers, Sarah slowly unbuttoned her cardigan and pushed up the sleeve of her shirt, revealing the intricate eagle tattoo that had caused so much controversy. The design was even more detailed than Colonel Mitchell had glimpsed earlier. Every feather perfectly rendered, the eagle's eyes fierce and proud, the Semper Fi banner flowing beneath its talons. But it was the coordinates beneath the banner that made Colonel Mitchell's breath catch in his throat. He recognized those numbers immediately, even after all these years. They represented a specific location in Afghanistan, a place where something terrible and heroic had happened on a day he would never forget. Without a word, Colonel Mitchell began removing his own jacket. Robert watched in confusion as the distinguished officer rolled up the sleeve of his polo shirt, revealing his own tattoo, an eagle nearly identical to Sarah's, with the same coordinates inscribed below the Semper Fi banner. The room fell silent except for the soft beeping of medical monitors. Robert's mouth dropped open in shock, while Sarah stared at the colonel's tattoo with tears forming in her eyes. "These coordinates," Colonel Mitchell said quietly, his voice heavy with emotion, "represent grid reference 41S FR 12345678890, approximately 15 kilometers northeast of Forward Operating Base Chapman in Afghanistan. On March 15, 2019, at approximately 14:30 hours, a Marine convoy was ambushed in that location." Sarah nodded slowly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know, sir. I was there." "You were there?" Robert repeated, his earlier anger replaced by confusion and growing realization. Colonel Mitchell continued, his eyes never leaving Sarah's face. The convoy included members of the 1st Marine Expeditionary Force and a medical support team. When the lead vehicle hit an improvised explosive device, the medics in the convoy immediately moved forward under heavy fire to treat the wounded. "Hospital Corpsman 2nd Class Sarah Martinez," Sarah said, completing the story. "I was with the medical support team attached to your unit, Colonel. It was my first deployment." The revelation hit Robert like a thunderbolt. Hospital Corpsman was the official Navy title for medics who served with Marine units. Sarah wasn't just a civilian with a military tattoo. She was a veteran who had served in combat alongside Marines, risking her life to save wounded warriors. Colonel Mitchell's voice grew softer as he continued. 4 Marines were critically wounded in that ambush. The medics who treated them under fire saved all 4 lives. One of those medics was wounded herself when a mortar round landed close to the casualty collection point. Sarah unconsciously touched her left side, where shrapnel scars were hidden beneath her scrubs. "Minor injuries, sir. Nothing compared to what the Marines went through." "Minor injuries?" Colonel Mitchell shook his head. "I read the after-action report. You continued treating wounded Marines for another 20 minutes after being hit by shrapnel yourself. You didn't seek medical attention until all the casualties were stabilized and evacuated." Robert stared at Sarah with new understanding. His earlier hostility completely evaporated. "You were a Navy corpsman. You served with Marines in combat?" 3 deployments, Sarah confirmed quietly. "Afghanistan twice, Iraq once. I left the Navy in 2021 and went to nursing school. I wanted to continue serving veterans, just in a different capacity." Colonel Mitchell rolled his sleeve back down, but the impact of the revelation continued to resonate through the room. The tattoo coordinates marked the location where Corpsman Martinez and her team saved the lives of 4 Marines under enemy fire. It's not a fashion statement or a symbol of false honor. It's a memorial to one of the finest examples of courage under fire I've ever witnessed. The weight of Robert's earlier accusations hung heavily in the air. He had spent weeks being treated by a genuine war hero, someone who truly understood the sacrifices and trauma of combat, and he had dismissed her as a pretender. "Corpsman Martinez," Robert said, using her proper military title for the first time. "I owe you an apology. I had no right to question your service or your integrity." Sarah moved closer to Robert's wheelchair, her professional demeanor returning. "You don't owe me anything, Robert. You're dealing with your own pain and frustration. That's understandable. But I do owe you," Robert insisted. "You've been trying to help me heal, and I've been treating you like an outsider who couldn't possibly understand what I'm going through." "You understand better than most people." Colonel Mitchell observed this interaction with satisfaction. In his experience, some of the most effective healing happened when veterans realized they weren't alone in their struggles. The bond between those who had served in combat was unlike any other relationship, built on shared experiences that civilians could rarely comprehend. "Perhaps," the colonel suggested gently, "this might be a good time to reconsider that physical therapy session." Robert looked up at Sarah with new respect and determination. "Corman, if you think I should do the therapy, then I'll do it. But I have one request, and what's that?" Sarah asked. "I want you to be there when I take my first steps. You helped save other Marines under fire. I'd be honored to have you help me learn to walk again." As they prepared to leave Robert's room, Colonel Mitchell reflected on the unexpected turn the day had taken. He had come to Millfield to evaluate a small-town VA hospital, but instead he had witnessed something much more significant. The moment when truth replaced assumption, when respect replaced prejudice, and when two veterans found common ground in their shared commitment to healing. Word of the dramatic revelation in Robert Chen's room spread through the hospital with remarkable speed. Within an hour, every staff member knew that their colleague Sarah Martinez was not just a dedicated nurse, but a decorated Navy corpsman who had served 3 combat deployments and earned her tattoo through extraordinary courage under fire. Dr. Peterson found Colonel Mitchell in the hospital's small conference room, reviewing his notes from the day's observations. The colonel looked up as the doctor entered, his expression thoughtful and somewhat somber. "I understand there was quite a scene in room 314, Dr. Peterson said, settling into a chair across from the colonel. "I'm hearing remarkable stories about Nurse Martinez's military service." Colonel Mitchell set down his pen and leaned back in his chair. "Dr. Peterson, in 30 years of military service, I've known thousands of Marines and sailors. Very few have demonstrated the kind of courage and selflessness that Corpsman Martinez showed that day in Afghanistan. She never mentioned her military background when she applied for the position," Dr. Peterson said. "Her resume listed her nursing credentials and previous hospital experience, but nothing about combat service." "That doesn't surprise me," Colonel Mitchell replied. "Many veterans, especially women, face skepticism when they mention their military service. It's often easier to let their work speak for itself rather than deal with constant questions and assumptions." The colonel paused, gathering his thoughts before continuing. "What happened in Afghanistan wasn't just about treating wounded Marines under fire, though that alone would have been noteworthy. The situation was much more complex and dangerous than most people would understand." Colonel Mitchell had been a lieutenant colonel at the time, serving as the battalion commander for the unit that was ambushed that day. The memory of those events remained vivid in his mind, replayed countless times over the years in official debriefings, award ceremonies, and private moments of reflection. "The convoy was conducting a routine supply mission when they hit the IED," he explained. "But the explosive device was just the beginning of a coordinated attack. Enemy fighters had positioned themselves in the surrounding hills, waiting to target anyone who responded to the initial blast." Dr. Peterson listened intently as Colonel Mitchell described the tactical situation that had unfolded that day. The medical team, including Corpsman Martinez, had been traveling in the rear vehicle of the convoy, protected by distance from the initial explosion but vulnerable to the sustained enemy fire that followed. Standard protocol would have been to wait for additional support before attempting to reach the wounded, Colonel Mitchell continued, but the Marines in the lead vehicle were critically injured and bleeding out. Every minute of delay increased the likelihood that they wouldn't survive. The colonel's voice grew quieter as he recalled the radio communications from that day. He had been monitoring the situation from the forward operating base, coordinating air support and additional ground forces while listening to increasingly desperate reports from the convoy. "Commander, Corpsman Martinez made the decision to move forward to the casualty collection point without waiting for the area to be secured," Colonel Mitchell said. "She and her team crawled nearly 100 meters under direct enemy fire. carrying medical supplies and equipment weighing more than 60 pounds. The tactical details painted a picture of extraordinary courage that went far beyond the basic facts of the incident. Sarah had volunteered for the most dangerous assignment imaginable, providing medical care in an active combat zone while exposed to enemy fire from multiple directions. The Marines she treated included Corporal James Davidson, who had lost both legs below the knee, and Lance Corporal Michael Thompson, who had severe abdominal injuries and was going into shock, Colonel Mitchell continued. Without immediate medical intervention, both men would have died before evacuation helicopters could reach them. Dr. Peterson began to understand the full significance of Sarah's actions that day. As a medical professional himself, he knew that performing complex trauma care under ideal conditions was challenging enough. Doing so while under enemy fire with limited supplies and the constant threat of additional attacks was almost unimaginable. Corpsman Martinez worked on those casualties for nearly 40 minutes, Colonel Mitchell said. She stabilized their wounds, established IV lines, administered pain medication, and coordinated with the evacuation helicopter crews. When a mortar round landed 15 meters from her position, she shielded Corporal Davidson with her own body and continued working. The shrapnel from that mortar round had caused the minor injuries that Sarah had mentioned earlier. Colonel Mitchell's after-action report had documented multiple lacerations and embedded metal fragments, injuries that would have incapacitated most people, but hadn't stopped Sarah from completing her mission. All 4 Marines survived, Colonel Mitchell concluded. 2 of them made full recoveries and returned to duty. The other 2 were medically retired but went on to lead productive civilian lives. None of that would have been possible without Corpsman Martinez's actions. Dr. Peterson sat in silence for several moments, processing the magnitude of what he had learned. The quiet nurse who worked extra shifts and never complained had literally saved lives under the most extreme circumstances imaginable. Why didn't she receive more recognition for her actions? Dr. Peterson asked. Colonel Mitchell's expression darkened slightly. She was recommended for the Silver Star, the same award I received for actions during a different operation. But military politics and bureaucratic delays meant that the paperwork got lost in the system. By the time the error was discovered, Corpsman Martinez had already left active duty. The injustice of this administrative failure weighed heavily on Colonel Mitchell. He had spent months trying to correct the oversight, but Sarah had moved on with her life and hadn't pursued the matter herself. She seemed more interested in continuing to serve veterans than in receiving recognition for her past service. The tattoo, Dr. Peterson said, finally understanding its significance. It's not just a memorial, it's a record of what happened that day. Exactly, Colonel Mitchell confirmed. Those coordinates mark the precise location where 4 Marines were saved by the courage and skill of their corpsmen. It's a reminder that heroism isn't always recognized or rewarded, but it's always remembered by those who witness it. The colonel looked out the conference room window toward the patient care units where Sarah was continuing her work, probably unaware that her military service had become the subject of intense discussion. I got my tattoo 6 months after that deployment ended, Colonel Mitchell said. I wanted to honor the Marines who died under my command, but I also wanted to remember the ones who lived because of people like Corpsman Martinez. It's a reminder that leadership isn't just about giving orders, it's about recognizing and supporting the extraordinary people who serve under you. Dr. Peterson began to understand why Colonel Mitchell had insisted on seeing Sarah's tattoo. The colonel had recognized something familiar in her bearing and demeanor, and the coordinates had confirmed his suspicions about her identity. She probably thinks nobody remembers what she did, Dr. Peterson observed. Veterans often feel that way, Colonel Mitchell replied, especially those who served in support roles like medical personnel. They see themselves as just doing their jobs, not realizing that their jobs required extraordinary courage and dedication. As their conversation continued, both men reflected on the broader implications of what they had learned. Sarah's story challenged assumptions about who veterans were and what military service looked like. Her quiet professionalism and dedication to patient care made perfect sense when viewed through the lens of her combat experience. I think, Colonel Mitchell said slowly, it's time for this community to learn the truth about one of their most valuable residents. By evening, the truth about Sarah Martinez had begun to spread through Millfield in the same rapid fashion that the false rumors had circulated the day before. However, this time the story being shared was one of genuine heroism and sacrifice. Not gossip and speculation. Janet Williams, the night supervisor at the hospital, had been among the first to hear the details of Colonel Mitchell's revelation. As a veteran herself, she had served as an army nurse in Germany during the Cold War. Janet understood the significance of what Sarah had accomplished in Afghanistan. More importantly, she was outraged by the way her colleague had been treated by people who knew nothing about her background. "I'm calling my friend Margaret at the bookstore," Janet told Dr. Peterson as they discussed the situation. "Margaret was one of the people spreading rumors yesterday, and she needs to know the truth." Margaret Hawthorne answered her phone on the third ring, still bristling with righteous indignation about the inappropriate tattoo she had witnessed at the Morning Glory Cafe. She expected Janet to agree with her. Concerns about military symbols being misused by civilians. "Margaret, I need to tell you something important about Sarah Martinez," Janet began, her voice serious and controlled. "That tattoo you saw isn't what you think it is." Over the next 10 minutes, Janet carefully explained everything she had learned about Sarah's military service, her combat deployments, and the specific events commemorated by her tattoo. Margaret listened in growing silence, her earlier certainty crumbling with each new detail. "She's a genuine war hero?" Margaret asked quietly. "More than that," Janet replied. "She's a war hero who came home and chose to continue serving veterans instead of seeking recognition or benefits for herself. She could have leveraged her military service into any number of opportunities, but instead, she moved to a small town to work in a VA hospital." Margaret hung up the phone feeling sick to her stomach. She had spent an entire day spreading malicious gossip about someone who had risked her life to save others. The shame was overwhelming, but she knew she had a responsibility to correct the damage she had helped cause. Her first call was to her friend Linda, who worked at the bank with Frank Morrison. "Linda, I need you to tell Frank something very important about that nurse we were discussing yesterday." Meanwhile, at the Morning Glory Cafe, owner Patricia Collins was closing up for the evening when she received a call from Dr. Peterson himself. The doctor rarely involved himself in community affairs, but this situation was too important to ignore. "Patricia, I'm calling about something that happened at your cafe yesterday morning," Dr. Peterson began. "There were some serious misunderstandings about one of my staff members, and I think you should know the facts." Patricia listened in amazement as Dr. Peterson described Sarah's military service and the events that had led to the morning's revelation. By the time he finished speaking, Patricia was already planning how to make amends for her establishment's role in spreading false information. "Doctor, I had no idea," Patricia said. "We just saw the tattoo and made assumptions. I feel terrible about this." "The important thing now is setting the record straight," Dr. Peterson replied. "Sarah doesn't know that her personal business became public, and she doesn't deserve to face continued judgment based on false information." As word continued to spread, the reactions varied but followed a predictable pattern. People who had been quick to judge and condemn Sarah were now forced to confront their own prejudices and assumptions. Many felt genuine remorse for their hasty conclusions, while others simply felt embarrassed about being so completely wrong. Frank Morrison, the bank manager who had initiated much of the morning's gossip, received calls from 3 different people that evening. Each caller shared the same story about Sarah's military service, and each expressed dismay about the rumors that had circulated through town. "I can't believe I said those things about stolen valor," Frank told his wife Helen after hearing the full story. "This woman literally saved Marines' lives under enemy fire, and I accused her of pretending to be a veteran." Helen, who had called her sister in Dallas with the original gossip, now faced the humiliating task of calling back to correct the record. "I have to tell everyone I spoke to," she said. "We owe her that much." At the hospital, Sarah remained focused on her patients, unaware that her personal history had become the subject of intense community discussion. She was working with Danny Rodriguez, the young private who had lost both hands, helping him practice using adaptive equipment that would allow him to perform basic tasks independently. "You know what, Nurse Martinez?" Danny said as he successfully picked up a plastic cup using a prosthetic gripper. "I feel like you really understand what this is like. Most people try to be encouraging, but they don't really get it." Sarah smiled, thinking about how much more understanding Danny would feel if he knew about her own experiences with wounded Marines. "Everyone's journey is different, Danny, but you're stronger than you think, and you're going to surprise yourself with what you can accomplish." Colonel Mitchell had delayed his departure to observe the evening shift and complete his evaluation report. As he watched Sarah work with Danny and other patients, he was struck by the natural ease with which she connected with wounded veterans. Her military experience clearly informed her approach to patient care, even when her patients were unaware of her background. "She's remarkable," Dr. Peterson commented as they observed Sarah through the window of Danny's room. "I'm beginning to understand why our patient satisfaction scores are so high in the units where she works." "Combat medics develop a unique skill set," Colonel Mitchell replied. "They learn to provide care under the worst possible conditions while maintaining hope and determination. Those skills translate directly to civilian medical practice, especially when working with trauma patients." As the evening progressed, Colonel Mitchell made a decision that would have far-reaching consequences for Sarah's future. He had been carrying the burden of the administrative error that had prevented her from receiving proper recognition for years, and he finally had an opportunity to correct that injustice. "Dr. Peterson, I'd like to make a formal recommendation," Colonel Mitchell said as they concluded their discussions. "This hospital should nominate Corman Martinez for the Civilian Award for Humanitarian Service. Her military heroism speaks for itself, but her continued dedication to veterans' care deserves recognition." "I think that's an excellent idea," Dr. Peterson agreed. "But shouldn't she also receive the military recognition she was originally recommended for?" Colonel Mitchell smiled grimly. "I've already made some calls about that. Sometimes it takes a colonel's direct intervention to cut through bureaucratic red tape. But I have connections at the Pentagon who can expedite the paperwork." As Colonel Mitchell prepared to leave Millfield the next morning, he reflected on the unexpected turns his evaluation visit had taken. He had come to assess a small-town VA hospital and ended up witnessing the revelation of a genuine hero who had been hiding in plain sight. The irony wasn't lost on him that Sarah had faced more judgment and criticism from civilians in one day than she had probably experienced during 3 combat deployments. The very people who claimed to support veterans had been quick to attack someone they perceived as an imposter, without bothering to learn the truth about her service. But the community's response to learning that truth gave him hope. People were capable of recognizing their mistakes and working to correct them. The real test would be whether the lessons learned from this experience would lead to lasting changes in how the town treated veterans and others who might not fit conventional expectations. Sarah's story was far from over, and Colonel Mitchell suspected that the next chapter would be quite different from the quiet anonymity she had maintained since arriving in Millfield.